Hallo, herzlich willkommen zu unserem Gespräch über Flexilingualism, einem innovativen Konzept zur mehrsprachigen Kommunikation. Und herzlich willkommen auch Nick Byrne, von dem dieses Konzept stammt. Wir haben aus organisatorischen Gründen dieses Gespräch aufgezeichnet. Es wird jedoch die Möglichkeit geben, im Anschluss an das Video live Fragen zu stellen. Ich werde noch zur Verfügung stehen. In diesem Teil unserer Tagung geht es um die Suche nach innovativen Konzepten zur Verbesserung der mehrsprachigen Kommunikation, die dann auch natürlich auf die Städtepartnerschaften wirken können. Dabei werden wir uns ein paar Ideen ansehen, die über den traditionellen Fremdsprachenunterricht, den wir alle erlebt, genossen, erlitten haben. Und denn ich denke, das muss es nicht am Ende dann auch tatsächlich sein, sondern es gibt sicher alternative Möglichkeiten. Den ersten Kontext, den wir uns in diesem Zusammenhang ansehen möchten, ist der großen Metropolen Europas. Hier werden wir uns auf London und Berlin beschränken. Wie funktioniert in einer von Mehrsprachigkeit und Multikulturalität geprägten Umgebung denn eigentlich die Kommunikation? Wie zum Beispiel in London, wo 25% der Bevölkerung gar nicht Englisch als Erstsprache spricht. Oder Berlin, wo man an jeder Ecke das Spiel, das heitere Spracheraten ausprobieren kann, um mal sich zu überlegen, welche Sprache hört man denn da eigentlich. Ich freue mich, mit Nick Byrne einen Gesprächspartner zu haben, der nicht nur professionell sich sein Leben lang mit Sprache und mehrsprachiger Kommunikation beschäftigt, sondern dies auch privat und in seinem privaten Leben tut. Für ihn aus der Praxis in die Theorie und dann wieder zurück in die Praxis. Ich glaube, das ist ein Motto, Nick, mit dem du eigentlich auf dem Weg bist. Nach langen Berufsjahren als der Direktor der Sprachenzentren London School of the Arts und der London School of Economics ist er jetzt in Berlin gelandet, wo er als freiberuflicher Language Consultant lebt. Vielen Dank, Nick, dass du dich auf unser Experiment einlässt. Wir haben uns vorher geeinigt, dass wir Mehrsprachigkeit nicht nur darüber reden wollen, sondern das auch praktizieren. Und ich werde also in diesem Interview Englisch oder in diesem Gespräch Deutsch sprechen und Nick wird auf Englisch antworten. Fangen wir an. Link, du hast gelebt und lebst eigentlich immer in Städten, die geprägt sind von Multikulturalität und Mehrsprachigkeit. Du bist in Manchester geboren, hast lange Jahre in London gearbeitet und lebst jetzt in sicher einer der interessantesten Städte Deutschlands, nämlich in Berlin. Auch hier wieder multikulturell und mehrsprachig. Wie nimmst du dieses mehrsprachige Kommunikation in diesen Städten wahr? Oder vielleicht gibt es überhaupt keine mehrsprachige Kommunikation und alles ist English only. Man hört das ja. Nick.
I think, first of all, I'm sorry I can't be with you in person or virtually even with you in person. So I'm doubly virtual in a sense because I'm going to be recorded rather than live on the screen. But I'm very glad to take part in it and great to be asked. The questions you posed, Thomas, are fascinating because they touch on the areas to do with how we as professionals interact with multilingualism, i.e. our business is languages, language teaching, everything to do with it. But how I've realized is how I react with the question as a professional in languages and how I react as an individual, a person living now in a German-speaking country, and me being able to speak German, but I'm a Brit, I realize I'm a lot more vulnerable than I thought I would be. And I take things in sometimes very, very simple terms, and it's been a good lesson to learn. Growing up in Manchester as an English-speaking person, in a very, very nice suburb, meant that the whole sort of image we get of multicultural Manchester was sort of there. But you realise, we're talking the 1950s to 1960s, that it's there, but very much it just passed by me. You know, I went to school, one of the few things I was good at school was languages. And for me, languages was always about learning the language from Europe, French and German, me going to those places. And of course, the whole fact that there are a whole world of languages going in, particularly languages outside of Europe in the city, as a child, you don't. And I was a privileged, white, middle class background, you don't notice it. Coming to London, after having done a degree in languages, having spent some time abroad, you're far more aware, even though you're an outsider, and you realize the sort of danger there is of how you think you relate to what is your concept of languages. And in mine, it's very much European, what I do, the fact that I've spent time in other countries, a very privileged view. It wasn't to do with parents or grandparents or relatives. It's very much looking in. And I started to realize a lot later on that I was an observer. I was looking in to other people's languages. And as I grew up in London, and when you move to London, as I did in the late 70s, 1980s, you often lived in the poorer areas of London, which were those of mixed race, multicultural, multilingual. And it's then that it hit me, wow, there's a whole thing. And when I started actually to do some work as English as a second language, when I did teacher training, when I was working in what were then called how to approach community languages and the role of teaching English to these community languages in a way that was trying not to be imperialistic or patronizing. The complexity of it all really hit home. And then if you fast forward to today, being in Berlin in a multicultural, I now, you know, love the way that British people say, oh, we're not immigrants, we're expats. Well, no, I'm an immigrant now. And yes, I have a native language that is a global language, perceived as a global language, but it does put me into another position, albeit again from a very privileged point of view. So when you're looking at multiculturalism and pluriculturalism and flexilingualism, what you've got to remember, where are you coming from? How are you regarding it? Are you a power giver, a power taker? Are you somebody who is at the receiving end of what the language, the major dominant language is? Are you actually taking part of it? How do you approach it? Is it something to gain power, or have you already got power? These are so complex, and this is why I think it's interesting to support them.
Was ich interessant fand an dem, was du jetzt gerade gesagt hast, ist natürlich die Frage, und darauf läuft es vieles natürlich hinaus, ist die Frage der Einstellung. Der Einstellung zum Beispiel zu ganz bestimmten Sprachen. Und wir haben ja bei dieser Tagung, geht es ja um Deutsch und Polnisch, also Sprachen, die sich ja quasi ganz anders darstellen, wenn man das so will. Die Frage, die sich mir dann immer stellt, ist, wir sind es gewohnt, oder natürlich als monolingual Aufgewachsene, dass das Lernen einer Sprache sozusagen so die Entscheidung ist fürs Leben. Ja? Also ich mache eine große, wie viel Energie muss ich in die, und dann hat es natürlich dann manchmal keinen Sinn, Hindi zu lernen. Dann hat es manchmal keinen Sinn, Arabisch zu lernen, weil das schaffe ich sowieso nicht. Du hast mit deinem Konzept Flexilingualism genau diesen Punkt hier angegriffen oder aufgegriffen, dass du gesagt hast, wir müssen unsere Einstellung ändern, und Flexilingualism ist ja sozusagen, geht es ja nicht um eine Methode des Sprachenlernens, sondern um eine Veränderung von Einstellung. Vielleicht kannst du genau zu diesem Konzept etwas sagen, was ja dann weggeht von der Idee, einmal im Leben entscheide ich mich für Französisch und das war's dann.
Yeah, I think that the way you've portrayed that, and it's absolutely right. I mean, one of the reasons that I came to think about how I, as a person who's been involved in language teaching and language learning, working within international communities, at a very privileged level at somewhere like the London School of Economics, which is 80% non-English speaking, or people coming from non-English speaking countries. And working with a world that, it's such a cliche now, is ever more connected, is globalized, with a shifting part community. When you have the 2008 crash, with people moving around, with Europe always having, a shift of people moving up and down. What struck me is when, well, at least in Germany, in German, you can survive with the one word Mehrsprachigkeit. And you more or less know you're going, what slightly irritated me, and I don't know why it irritated me, because it's perfectly sensible that one has plurilingualism and multilingualism. They do mean different things. But it was the way of really nailing down something, which is in a sense fluid, that you have to sort of realize that just as there is a fluidity to the actual physical moving from one country to another, there's also a mental, a spiritual, an emotional, a conceptual identity fluidity that is moving, that you can't necessarily pin down. It's rather like saying to me, do you feel more German than English now? And it's to do obviously with the fact that I'm speaking German so much more, not all the time, because that's another story of why it's not happening. So what I realized, that we should be talking, even if it's only a word or a concept that can last for a certain amount of time, a few years before we move on. But if I can read out to you what I wrote, I said Flexilingualism is a pragmatic approach to learning languages. It implies a realistic attitude, realism, whereby language choices and levels are defined by need, situation, and context. It is a flexible and fluid process which responds to the specific yet changing needs of an increasingly mobile workforce in a globalized world. And it's the idea that it shifts, it moves, the needs. There is
darf ich unterbrechen, Nick? Weil ich genau diesen Punkt nochmal gerne herausstreichen würde. Das bedeutet aber nicht, um das mal praktisch zu sagen, dass wir sagen wir mal, Französisch fangen wir bei A1 des europäischen Referenzrahmen an und unser Ziel ist C2 in Französisch, sondern dass wir Mehrsprachigkeit, das heißt, dass wir mehr Sprachen lernen, aber vielleicht nicht immer dieses Akademische im Kopf haben, dass wir sagen, naja, eines Tages werde ich so perfekt sein, dass ich vom Publikum über die Philosophie von Wittgenstein erzählen kann. Das ist, glaube ich, der entscheidende Punkt in diesem Flexilingualism-Konzept, oder?
Absolutely. And what I quite like doing is just thinking of, basic examples, either that I've experienced, or I know other people have experienced. And it's the way that people from, let's say, poorer economic backgrounds that work in the service industries that might not have academic qualifications can actually speak really good standard of communicative language. And yet someone like me or other people with degrees and whatever would find that very, very difficult to learn it. So you have this interesting mismatch, if you look in terms of languages and academic activity, of some people just doing it, learning it, it might not be perfect, but it's totally communicative. Or others like, this whole thing, I can read Racine, but I can't order a meal in a restaurant. And if I can just do one personal story, I was lucky enough to get to Oxford. And I remember the year before I was going on my year abroad, where I went to Austria, and I was talking to my French tutor. And I just said, I'm a little bit worried because it's a joint degree and I've had to commit to one language or another. He said, well, really, the year abroad is nothing to do with me. I mean, he said, anyway, we're not here to teach you languages. It's something you do yourself. Something you do yourself. We're here to teach you literature. And although that's an extreme example, that whole thing of what language is, what you study, almost it's not quite academic enough. And when the people in our business, if you like, trash our product, then what hope is there in terms? It's far more complex.
Dann, du bist natürlich auch der geeignete Mensch, dem man diese Frage stellen kann. Welche Rolle siehst du eigentlich für Englisch in dem ganzen Zusammenhang? Auch die Frage zum Beispiel Englisch als eine Lingua franca, das ist ja oft der Weg aus dieser Mehrsprache, aus dem Dilemma, ich kann deine Sprache nicht, du kannst meine Sprache nicht. Gibt es da auch im Bereich oder in dem Zusammenhang mit Flexilingualism auch eine Rolle für Englisch?
Yeah, I think there is. Again, if you look at it, Flexilingualism is about approach. That I, as a modern linguist, so I'm born in England, grew up in England, I'm British, but have chosen to live outside of the UK. And my career has been in teaching languages. And I've regarded very much, because I was a school teacher for 12 years before moving into higher education, was to promote languages and to promote internationalism, love of Europe, you know, broaden horizons, concepts and things like that. So in the end, that I always had a very respectful distance from English. If anything, when I went to university, I then became more of an English for academic purposes. And I was very, it always worried me that I didn't want it to seem as an imperialistic thing. And there is a danger, obviously, for an English person, but with the concept of English as a lingua franca, with the reality that there are far more non-native speakers of English than native speakers of English, well, the fact is that's where it is. That if you sense you have to distance yourself by, I don't have any possession over English. And in terms of a tool, a medium of communication, that's fine. My issues are packing English up into some post-imperialist still structure of you know, an Anglo-Saxon dominated world, etc., etc., etc. But one thing I have noticed is people who are non-linguists don't worry as much as we do, because we, as professionals, either have guilt about how language is used and the power it can have. And sometimes it's quite interesting seeing what people's priorities are.
Nick, letzte Frage, sehr praktischer Natur. Wir reden ja über deutsch-polnische Städtepartnerschaften. Vorhin habe ich ja gesagt, dass Polnisch und Deutsch unterschiedliche Rollen spielen, dass wir auch mehr Polen haben, die mehr Deutsch können und so weiter. Was würdest du gerade einer Deutschen, der eine Städtepartnerschaft organisieren möchte, was würdest du ihm raten? Wie soll er eigentlich Polnisch in diese ganze Angelegenheit mit hineinbringen? Und was können die Sprachprofis dazu tun, wenn sie nicht ständig auf Übersetzer und Dolmetscher angewiesen bleiben möchten?
Yeah. It's funny, I bow to your greater knowledge in this, because I think that there's been a big thing, obviously, from the 1960s, 70s, of neighborhood languages, that you take two countries, you see the border, you put them in. There's obviously a lot was done between French and German in particular. The Polish and German whole question I find fascinating. It's something that I need to know a lot more about. I think that when you, in terms of like city partnerships, and I think there is need for a big revival for these, because it's something that's got lost. In the 90s within the UK, it started to unravel. The funding started to dry up. It seemed to be a non-necessary thing because people were going more and more on holiday. But I think that particularly between Germany and Poland, from historical reasons, for practical reasons of the present, it's so vital to make these marvelous geographical opportunities of cities being at the border, nearby, whatever work. And I think if you think, right, the aim is to bring people together. And I think from a language point of view, it has to be it has to be flexi. It has to be a flexilingual purpose, like getting people to understand the joy and fun of learning another language again, of people being able to speak Polish, German exchanges, you know, recognizing perhaps the imbalances that there might be in terms of exposure, but turning them into a positive. And then also, if English as a lingua franca can work and function as a communication tool, as a bridge, as a ways of keeping conversation going, then that's fine. But there's no one solution to it. There's no one way of doing it. And the whole point about being flexilingual is you don't start to create rules, because we've all done it, like only one language in my classroom. Don't do that. Don't fall into another world. This guilt thing of, I've not used it. And I think if there's one thing, there's enough guilt in the world to go around, or the last thing you want is linguistic guilt, which is what I suffer from all the time. And getting rid of that and being flexible approach, that's what it does. And you use whatever way it is to make the conversation work.
Ein wunderbares Schlusswort. Ganz herzlichen Dank, Nick. Und ich hoffe, dass wir uns mal wieder live sehen. Alles klar.
Okay.
Mach es gut. Tschüss.